When truth is called a lie, the lights go out, darkness falls, and indeed, if your light is darkness, how very deep will the darkness be? All the words in this book can be compressed into one word, the eternal word, Jesus the Christ.
The Baltimore Catechism says, "What sin is it to destroy one's own life, or commit suicide, as this act is called?" The answer is, it is a mortal sin to destroy one's own life or commit suicide, as this act is called, and persons who willfully and knowingly commit such an act die in a state of mortal sin, and are deprived of Christian burial. It is also wrong to expose oneself unnecessarily to the danger of death by rash or foolhardy feats of daring. And this is consistent with the Catechism of Trent, which says, "The fifth commandment also forbids suicide. No man possesses such power over his own life as to be at liberty to put himself to death." Hence, we find that the commandment does not say, "Thou shalt not kill another," but simply, "Thou shalt not kill." St. Thomas Aquinas explains why suicide is a mortal sin. It is altogether unlawful to kill oneself for 3 reasons. First, because everything naturally loves itself, the result being that everything naturally keeps itself in being, and resists corruption so far as it can. Wherefore, suicide is contrary to the inclination of nature, and to charity, whereby every man should love himself. Hence, suicide is always a mortal sin, as being contrary to the natural law and to charity. Secondly, because every part, as such, belongs to the whole. Now every man is a part of the community, and as such, he belongs to the community. Hence, by killing himself, he injures the community. Thirdly, because life is God's gift to man, and subject to his power, it is God who kills and makes to live. Hence, whoever takes his own life sins against God. Like any other sin, insanity may excuse the sin of suicide. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote, "If the ignorance be such as to exclude the use of reason entirely, it excuses from sin altogether, as in the case with madmen and imbeciles." So we can see in a series of questions and answers that appeared in the Catholic Advance that church teaching was upheld into modern times. Question: is willful suicide a mortal sin? Answer: it is a mortal sin. Question: is there ever a just reason for committing suicide? Answer: there is never a just cause for suicide. But then came the Second Vatican Council, and many changes to church teaching. The new Catechism of the Catholic Church says, grave psychological disturbances, anguish, or grave fear of hardship, suffering, or torture can diminish the responsibility of one committing suicide. Well, this seems very new and different. St. Thomas Aquinas told us that insanity, as seen in a madman or imbecile, diminishes sin, but the new Catechism uses the vague and broad term psychological disturbances. Sometimes a person might wake up in the morning feeling very depressed, and then decides to kill themselves. Depression is very different from the insanity of a madman. The Catholic Advance had this to say. Question: are people always considered insane who commit suicide? Answer: it would appear that such is the growing opinion. This is not true. We know that despair often leads to suicide. We are told that we may not despair. It is a sin not to hope in God. Certainly, Judas committed suicide, yet no one has questioned his sanity. Irreligion is more the cause of suicide than insanity, be that temporary or perpetual. If the first part of this sentence is questionable, there is no doubt that the rest of it is just foolishness and is a novelty. The New Catechism tells us that anguish diminishes responsibility for suicide. So let's look at an example of anguish. Say a teenager is dating a girl who broke up with him. The feeling that teenager could truly be characterized as anguish. So, would that have diminished the teenager's responsibility if he decides to go home and shoot himself in the head? It certainly wouldn't, according to the pre-conciliar church. Question: is it ever lawful to commit suicide? Answer: suicide is a terrible crime, and it's never allowed or justifiable. There is never a just cause for suicide. Man is not master of his life. God alone is master of life and death. St. John of the Cross tells us that we should offer our anguish up to God. Strive always to prefer not that which is consolation, but rather that which is disconsolateness. Moving on, the new Catechism of the Catholic Church also claims that grave fear of a hardship can diminish the responsibility of one committing suicide. If we are to believe St. Thomas Aquinas, this statement from the Novus Ordo Catechism isn't at all Catholic. The passage from this life to another and happier one is subject not to man's free will, but to the power of God. Hence, it is not lawful for man to take his own life that he may pass to a happier life, nor that he may escape any unhappiness whatsoever of the present life, because the ultimate and most fearsome evil of this life is death. Therefore, to bring death upon oneself in order to escape from anguish or other afflictions of this life is to adopt a greater evil in order to avoid a lesser. Again, hardships are not a justifiable cause of suicide. Instead, they are something to be offered up to God. St. John of the Cross tells us, strive always to prefer not that which gives the most pleasure, but rather that which gives the least. Also, a grave fear of hardship leading one to suicide suggests that the person is suffering from the sin of despair, which is a sin in itself. So rather than reducing responsibility for the suicide, there are actually two sins, two mortal sins, the sin of despair coupled with the sin of suicide. But the Novus Ordo Catechism continues to blur good and evil, and it even gets much worse. It tries to tell us that grave fear of suffering can diminish the responsibility of someone committing suicide. I don't know what knucklehead wrote this part of the catechism, but whoever wrote it didn't really understand what Catholicism is all about. The Catholic Church has always taught that sufferings can be blessings to us because they allow us to gain graces. And this part of the Novus Ordo Catechism is a complete rupture with what Catholics have always believed. St. John of the Cross tells us, true spirituality seeks for God's sake that which is distasteful rather than that which is delectable, and inclines itself rather to suffering than to consolation, and desires to go without blessings for God's sake rather than to possess them and to endure aridities and afflictions. Question. Some seem to think that suicide is justified in certain circumstances. Is this true? Answer. Suicide is a terrible crime and is never under any circumstances justifiable. There is never a just cause for suicide. Man is not a master of his life. God alone is master over life and death. We are told that in ancient times, the suicide was buried at the crossroads so that all who passed might trample upon his grave. Since suicide is and was a mortal sin, the Code of Canon Law of 1917 specifies, those who attempt to kill themselves by their own hand, if indeed death follows, are deprived of the ecclesiastical burial. The Novus Ordo Church and the Novus Ordo Press are now extremely dishonest, and they won't even admit to this attempted change to Catholic teaching. So it takes a secular newspaper without a hidden agenda to be honest when it observes that Catholic doctrine was changed when the Novus Ordo Church allowed a Catholic priest to be given a funeral after he committed suicide. As you probably know, the suicide rate has been increasing all over the world. This section of the Novus Ordo Catechism, which deals with suicide, is all about culpability for suicides. And I submit to you that it is the Novus Ordo Church itself which bears at least some culpability for the rising rate of suicides, because it is no longer clearly teaching that suicide is a mortal sin. Because the Novus Ordo Church's willful and wanton negligence, fewer people fear the consequences of suicide due to the false compassion of the Novus Ordo Church. So, there are uncounted souls suffering the eternal torments of hell, at least in part to the Novus Ordo Church's false compassion. The Novus Ordo Church has blood on its hands, and it has made a radical departure from Catholic teaching. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll be back again within a week with another one, but in the meantime, please check out my Facebook page and my Twitter page. Every day I post additional content that you won't find on this YouTube channel, and also, please pray for the Church.